All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're looking at a really fascinating and I have to say, pretty challenging text by an anonymous author. It lays out a whole new way to think about Islam, one that's built for someone with a modern, analytical, even a pro-science mindset. The author calls this idea BioIslam, and it kicks off not with a gentle hello, but with a pretty blunt warning.
So right out of the gate, the author sets this incredibly direct tone. This isn't just a heads up, it's labeled a trigger warning, and the language, it's clearly chosen to be provocative. Words like rudely conflict and romantic myths, that's designed to tell you right away that this is not going to be a comfortable read. It's a challenge, basically, asking the reader to put aside their preconceptions and get ready for a serious intellectual deep dive.
So, who is this actually for? Well, the author is super specific about it. This is written for Muslims who are already comfortable with things like critical thinking and scientific reasoning. They even say that if you don't really have that mindset, you just won't get it. And the author stays anonymous, explaining that it's to protect the feelings of their more traditionalist friends and family who they still care about deeply. You know, that choice of anonymity really highlights the personal stakes here and just how controversial these ideas might be.
Okay, so we've got the tone and the audience. Now, let's get to the why. What's the problem that's so big that it requires this kind of radical rethinking of an entire faith? The author lays it all out as a set of 5 huge, interconnected crises that they see in the modern Muslim world. They call them the Big Five.
And here they are. The author says poverty is the one you can see most easily, but it's really being fed by a constant brain drain of talented people leaving. And that, in turn, is just a symptom of even deeper problems: authoritarianism in governments, patriarchy that sidelines half the population, and this widespread politicization of religion that so often turns into conflict. For the author, you can't just tackle one of these. They're all tangled together, and you have to address the whole web to really improve people's lives.
Now, what's really interesting is that the author doesn't just make these big claims without any backup. To prove the point about politicization, they don't just say it's a problem, they ground it in actual evidence. The slide shows a data point they reference in a footnote from the Corruption Perception Index. Using a specific detail like this is a signal that this whole analysis is meant to be rigorous and data-driven, not just someone's opinion.
Of those Big Five problems, the author singles out authoritarianism as the main root of it all. But here's where they make a really critical connection. It's not just about politics. The author argues that a culture of political authoritarianism bleeds into theology. It creates the perfect environment for something called taqlid, which is basically following religious rulings from scholars without asking for the reasoning behind them. It's a kind of blind faith, the total opposite of the analytical thinking the author is trying to encourage.
So, we've got the problems. You could call them the symptoms. But what's the author's diagnosis of the actual disease? This is where the argument moves from politics and society right into the heart of Islamic history and how its core texts have been interpreted.
This right here, this is the pivotal question. The author knows that a lot of challenges in the Muslim world get blamed on colonialism, and they agree it's a factor. But they say, nope, that's not the whole story. Our problems started way before that. By saying that, they force the reader to look inward, at the community's own history, and ask that much more uncomfortable question: what did we do wrong?
And to drive that point home, the author brings up what they call nagging questions, things from history that just don't quite add up if you have a purely romantic view of the past. First, why didn't the ulama, the religious scholars, lead the world in abolishing slavery, especially when the Quran talks so much about freeing slaves? And second, the really big one, is it possible that the Prophet's actual life was very different from the story we get from traditional sources?
Okay, this is the absolute core of the diagnosis. The author proposes we split our understanding of the Prophet's example into 2. On one side, there's the textual sunnah. That's all the traditional books, the hadith, the biographies that describe his life. The author believes these texts, which were written down hundreds of years later, have some major formative errors. But on the other side, there's the original sunnah, what the Prophet actually did and said. The author suggests this true example is now unknowable, lost to history, but was fundamentally different from what got written down. It's a clever move because it allows them to critique the tradition without, in their mind, critiquing the Prophet himself.
Okay, so after laying out the problems and this pretty controversial diagnosis, the author finally gets to the solution. If traditional Islam is based on a flawed textual sunnah, what's the alternative? And that brings us to their big idea, BioIslam.
So what is BioIslam? It's defined as a theo-humanist and pro-science interpretation. Theo-humanist.
That basically suggests a focus on both God and on human well-being, on reason, on progress. And pro-science, well, that means a commitment to using evidence and critical thinking to understand the world and your faith. The author just calls it scientific Islam for short.
And here you can see how this BioIslam idea actually works. It goes back and gives new answers to those nagging historical questions from before. Did the ulama fail on slavery? No. BioIslam suggests the Prophet himself actually got rid of it, but later rulers just ignored him and brought it back. Was the Prophet's life like the stories we have? No. This framework says he lived differently, and those texts are just flawed records. The ultimate goal here is to build an Islam that's focused on actually solving the Big Five and creating a better world.
Now, these are some huge, world-changing ideas. It would be easy to read all this and think the author sounds arrogant. And they seem to be aware of that, because in the last part of the introduction, the whole tone changes. It shifts from this confident diagnosis to a really humble, personal reflection on their own journey searching for truth.
The author makes it very clear that they are not a traditionally trained Islamic scholar. They don't have the typical credentials. Instead, they offer a different kind of qualification: intellectual honesty, a deep curiosity, and a PhD in a scientific, evidence-based field. It's a deliberate attempt to redefine what gives someone the authority to speak on these topics. It's not about tradition. It's about the commitment to a process of honest inquiry. This, for me, is maybe the most important sentence in the whole piece. It's such a humble admission. The author straight up says, I could be wrong about all of this. But they argue that the risk of being wrong is just part of any real search for truth. For them, it's the act of sincerely searching that brings you closer to God, no matter where you end up. The journey is just as important as the destination.
And the author closes with this incredible piece of wisdom, which is attributed to Imam Ali. It just perfectly sums up the entire message. It's a plea to the reader to stop relying on authority figures, to stop deciding if something is true based on who's saying it. Instead, you have to figure out the truth for yourself through your own reason and research. And only then will you be able to recognize who is actually speaking the truth.
And so the author leaves us right here with this open question. After walking us through these huge problems, a radical diagnosis, and a bold solution, we're left to just think. Maybe the point of BioIslam isn't to be the one final correct answer. Maybe its real purpose is to show us a way of believing, a way that isn't defined by certainty or blind faith, but by an honest, courageous, and never-ending search for truth. Is that sincere journey what really matters in the end? That's the question we're left to ponder.